which says that we can have everything we desire. Reality is never an impediment to what we want. We just have to dig deep enough within ourselves and focus on happiness and grasp that we are truly exceptional. I hear Obama speak about education without acknowledging that the mess that we're in was orchestrated by the best educated among us, people like Summers and Harvard and others. The problem isn't education, the problem is greed. And we have undergone this, what John Wilson Saw calls this corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. And it's over. They've won. The last book I did with the great cartoonist Joe Sacco, if you don't know Footnotes in Gaza, it was a masterpiece. I speak as the former Middle East bureau chief of the New York Times. It's one of the great books on the Palestine-Israel conflict. But there we went into the poorest pockets of America. Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States. Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where the average male has a life expectancy of 48. That is the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. People live in sod huts in Pine Ridge, and at any one time, 60% of them have neither electricity or running water. This is America. We don't see this in America. They've been rendered invisible. And part of the reason I worked with Joe in 50 pages of illustrations in the book is because I wanted within the text to make those our corporate press have rendered invisible visible in the same way that A.G. Walker Evans did in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which was kind of a rough template for the book. Those books all attempted to diagnose where we were. The last book in particular asking us to look closely at these sacrifice zones. We were in southern West Virginia where they're blowing the tops off the Appalachian Mountains because they don't want to dig down to the coal seams, creating billion-gallon impoundment ponds with heavy metals and lead and toxins, places where in these old coal camps, cancer is an epidemic, the air and the water are poisoned. You walk into the nurse's office in elementary schools and you just see rows of little inhalers for the children. People in their despair are consuming huge quantities of Oxycontin, and you would start doing interviews, and it was as if you were interviewing zombies. And we would get phone calls, we were talking about people in their 20s and 30s, after we had left, and they would have died of an overdose for the people we interviewed. That despair, that destruction of the environment, and it's incumbent upon us to look closely at what's happening in these sacrifice zones because we've all become a sacrifice zone now. As Karl Marx understood, unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. It has no internal constraints, and once you remove external constraints, it commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion and collapse. And that's why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. And we just saw Obama approve drilling in the Arctic. $500 million drill bits dropped into the Arctic Sea to profit off the death throes of our planet. In theological terms, these corporate forces are forces of death, literally. If we stop all carbon emissions today, we would still deal with catastrophic climate change. And yet, because the fossil fuel industry, which has worldwide subsidies of $5.4 trillion, has no intention of halting the degradation and destruction of the ecosystem on which we as human beings and many other species depend for life. What we have seen is the rise of a state that no longer responds responds to the most basic needs, demands, and rights of the citizen. Nobody wants wholesale government surveillance and the evisceration of their privacy. And yet we are the most photographed, monitored, eavesdropped, watched population in human history, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. When your government watches you 24 hours a day, you can no longer use the word liberty. That is the relationship of a master and a slave. And you never want governments to accrue to themselves this kind of power. Because if those tiny elites feel threatened, they will use it. The reinterpretation by courts of our most cherished constitutional rights, mocking the intent of those who wrote the Constitution, so that through Citizens United, unlimited corporate cash is interpreted as the right to petition the government. The decision by the executive branch to misinterpret the 2001 authorization to use Military Force Act as giving them the right to assassinate American citizens. The bailouts in 2008, constituent polls were 100 to 1 across the political spectrum against the bailouts, which have now exploded into trillions of dollars. Bloomberg News did a piece a year ago in which they looked at the big 10 banks, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Wells Fargo, who can borrow money from the Fed at 0.8%, which they calculated was in essence an annual bank subsidy of $80 billion. And they said that if that subsidy was lifted